Baby saw a bear cub stuck in a bank's revolving door. What he did next stopped traffic. The morning air carried something different that Tuesday. Ethan Marshall felt it the moment he stepped outside with his 10-month-old son Leo strapped to his chest in the baby carrier. The usual sounds of Pine Ridge coming to life seemed muted, as if the entire town was holding its breath for something it didn't yet know was coming. Leo's tiny fingers wrapped around Ethan's thumb, and the baby made soft gurgling sounds that seemed to echo in the unusual quiet. The streets were already busy with people heading to work, but there was a strange quality to the movement, like everyone was walking through honey, slow and deliberate. Ethan had planned a simple walk to the bank to deposit a check, the same routine he'd done dozens of times before, but something in Leo's eyes told him this morning would be different. The baby wasn't crying or fussing, but his gaze was fixed ahead with an intensity that seemed impossible for someone so young. The First National Bank of Pine Ridge stood at the corner of Main and Oak, its glass revolving door catching the morning sun and throwing rainbow patterns across the sidewalk. Ethan approached slowly, adjusting Leo's hat against the cool breeze when he heard it. A sound that didn't belong. It wasn't quite a growl, wasn't quite a whimper, but something in between that made every hair on his neck stand up. He stopped 20 feet from the entrance, and that's when he saw it. There, trapped in the revolving doors compartment, was a small black bear cub. Its fur was matted with morning dew, its eyes wide with a fear that looked almost human. The cub couldn't have been more than 6 months old, probably separated from its mother during the night's foraging. It pushed against the glass with its small paws, turning the door slightly but not enough to free itself, then backing up and trying again. Over and over in a heartbreaking cycle. People were already gathering, forming a semicircle at what they must have thought was a safe distance. Jessica Brooks from the coffee shop next door had her phone out, recording everything. Logan Carter, the bank manager, stood frozen at the entrance to his own building, his keys dangling uselessly from his hand. Nobody knew what to do. Animal control wouldn't open for another hour, and the local police were probably not equipped to handle a bear, even a small one. The cub let out another sound. This one definitely more whimper than growl, and that's when something extraordinary happened. Leo, who had been silent until now, made a sound back. It wasn't a cry or a laugh or any sound Ethan had heard his son make before. It was almost musical, a soft humming that seemed to vibrate through Ethan's chest where the baby was pressed against him. The cub stopped pushing against the glass, its head tilted, ears perking up, and for a moment, everyone forgot to breathe. The baby and the bear were looking at each other through the glass door, and something was passing between them that none of the adults could understand. Leo made the sound again, longer this time, and his tiny hand reached out toward the door. Ethan found himself walking forward without consciously deciding to do so, as if his son was directing him. The crowd gasped, someone shouted for him to stop, but Ethan couldn't seem to control his own feet. He stopped just 3 feet from the door, close enough to see the individual whiskers on the cub's snout, close enough to see that its eyes weren't black like he'd thought, but a deep, warm brown that reminded him of Leo's eyes. The cub had gone completely still now, watching Leo with an intensity that should have been frightening, but somehow wasn't. Leo continued his strange humming, and incredibly the cub began to sway slightly, as if dancing to a rhythm only it and the baby could hear. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the street, and still nobody moved. Traffic had stopped completely, drivers getting out of their cars to see what was happening. Savannah Reed, who worked at the newspaper, was there now too, but even she seemed to have forgotten about getting the story, mesmerized by whatever was happening between the baby and the bear. Then Leo did something that made Ethan's heart skip. The baby leaned forward in the carrier, pressing his tiny palm flat against Ethan's chest, right over his heart. The humming changed, became more rhythmic, matching Ethan's heartbeat. And impossibly, unbelievably, the cub placed its paw against the glass in the exact same spot, as if it could feel the rhythm too. The revolving door began to turn, slowly, so slowly that at first nobody noticed. But it was moving. Not because the cub was pushing, but because it had found the rhythm. The same rhythm Leo was humming. The same rhythm of Ethan's heart. Michael Hayes, who ran the hardware store, whispered something about calling animal control again, but his voice seemed to come from very far away. The world had shrunk to just this moment. Just this impossible connection between a human baby and a bear cub. The door continued its slow revolution, and the cub moved with it, no longer fighting, no longer afraid. It was as if Leo was teaching it something, showing it the way out through some language that existed before words, before fear, before the separation between human and animal. The door turned another degree, then another. The opening was getting closer to the cub's position. Everyone could see it now, the path to freedom just inches away, but the cub wasn't looking at the opening. It was still watching Leo, still swaying to that strange, beautiful rhythm. Leo's humming grew softer, and the cub's movements became more confident. It was learning, Ethan realized with a shock. His 10-month-old son was somehow teaching a bear cub how to escape, not through force or panic, but through patience and rhythm, and something that looked impossibly like trust. Connor Adams from the sheriff's office had arrived, but even he stood back, recognizing that something was happening here that was beyond his jurisdiction, beyond anyone's understanding. The entire street had gone quiet except for Leo's humming and the soft squeak of the revolving door turning. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing, as if nature itself was holding its breath. The cub was almost at the opening now, just a few more inches and it would be free, but it still hadn't looked away from Leo, and Leo impossibly hadn't looked away from it. That's when Ethan noticed something that made his chest tighten. There were tears on Leo's cheeks. His baby son was crying, but not from fear or discomfort. These were different tears, the kind Ethan had seen only once before, when Leo had first seen his grandmother after she'd been in the hospital for weeks. They were tears of recognition, of reunion, of something deeper than emotion that didn't have a name. The cub made a soft sound, almost like a purr, and Leo giggled. It was the most normal baby sound in the world, and yet in that moment, it was magic. The door aligned perfectly with the opening. The cub could leave now, could run back to the woods, back to its mother, back to its world, but it didn't move. It sat there, looking at Leo, waiting. Leo's humming had stopped, and now he was just smiling, that gummy baby smile that usually meant he wanted milk or had seen something shiny. But this smile was different. This smile was goodbye. The baby raised his tiny hand and waved, the uncoordinated baby wave that looked more like he was batting at the air. The cub stood up, shook itself like a dog shaking off water, and stepped backward through the opening. It should have run then. Every instinct should have sent it sprinting for the safety of the trees. But it didn't. It sat down on the sidewalk, right there in front of the bank, and looked back at Leo one more time. Then it did something that nobody who was there would ever forget. Something that would be talked about in Pine Ridge for generations. The cub raised its paw and waved back. Not a random movement, not a stretch or a scratch, but a deliberate wave, mimicking exactly what Leo had done. Then it turned and walked away, not running, not afraid, just walking with a confidence that seemed impossible for a cub that had been trapped and terrified just minutes before. The crowd stayed frozen for another heartbeat, then erupted. People were crying, laughing, talking all at once. Someone said it was a miracle. Someone else said it was impossible, that bears don't wave, that babies can't communicate with wild animals. But Ethan wasn't listening to any of them. He was looking at Leo, who had gone quiet again, his eyes already getting heavy the way they did when he was ready for his morning nap. The baby yawned, snuggled against Ethan's chest, and fell asleep as if nothing extraordinary had happened, as if he hadn't just done something that defied every law of nature and logic. Haley Dawson from the local news had arrived with a camera crew, but Ethan was already walking away. He didn't want to explain what couldn't be explained, didn't want to reduce what had happened to a soundbite or a headline. He held Leo closer, feeling the baby's warm breath against his neck, and wondered what other mysteries his son carried inside him. The walk home felt different than the walk there. The world looked the same, but Ethan knew it wasn't. Something had shifted. Some invisible barrier had been crossed, and he would never see things quite the same way again. That night, after Leo was asleep in his crib, Ethan stood at the window looking out at the dark woods beyond their backyard. Somewhere out there, a bear cub was probably curled up with its mother, safe and warm. Did it remember what had happened? Did it understand it any better than Ethan did? He thought about the rhythm Leo had hummed, tried to recreate it, but it was already fading from memory like a dream upon waking. Maybe that was how it was supposed to be. Maybe some things weren't meant to be understood, just experienced and treasured. The local paper ran the story the next day, of course. "Baby saves bear cub from bank door" was the headline, with a photo someone had managed to snap of Leo and the cub looking at each other through the glass. But the photo didn't capture it, not really. It didn't show the rhythm, the connection, the moment when two different species recognized something in each other that transcended biology and reason. It just showed a baby and a bear, separated by glass, frozen in black and white. Ethan cut out the article anyway, put it in Leo's baby book. Someday, when Leo was older, he would show it to him. But he wondered if Leo would remember, or if this would just be another story his dad told him, another family legend that might or might not be true. 3 days later, Ethan was walking with Leo again, this time through the park. They were near the edge where the maintained grass met the wild forest when Ethan saw it, or rather, them. The bear cub was there, at the tree line, with what must have been its mother, a massive black bear that should have sent Ethan running in the opposite direction. But the mother bear wasn't looking at Ethan. She was looking at Leo. And Leo, who had been fussing about his morning bottle, went quiet and still. The mother bear stepped forward, just one step, into the sunlight. The cub stayed beside her, and Ethan could swear it was the same cub from the bank. It had the same eyes, the same tilt to its head. Leo made the sound again, that humming that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his tiny body should be able to produce. The mother bear's ears twitched, and she made a sound back, a low rumble that Ethan felt more than heard. It wasn't threatening, it was almost like she was saying, "Thank you." Then she turned and walked back into the forest, the cub following after one last look at Leo. Ethan stood there for a long time after they were gone, holding his son and wondering what kind of child he was raising. What kind of world Leo would grow up to see that might be invisible to everyone else. The story spread beyond Pine Ridge, of course. Videos went viral. Experts were called in to explain that what people thought they saw couldn't have happened. Bears don't wave. Babies can't communicate with wild animals. The revolving door must have had a malfunction that coincidentally freed the cub. But the people who were there knew better. They had felt it. That moment when the impossible became possible. when a baby and a bear spoke a language older than words. Some of them started looking at their own children differently, wondering what other abilities might be lying dormant, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Jacob Bennett, who owned the bookstore, started a collection of similar stories from around the world. Stories of children who seemed to understand animals, of moments when the barrier between human and nature became permeable. He filled a whole shelf with these books, and people would come in just to browse them, looking for explanations or maybe just for confirmation that what they had witnessed was real. But Ethan never went to look at those books. He didn't need confirmation. Every night when he put Leo to bed, he could see it in his son's eyes, that deep knowing that had nothing to do with his age or development. As weeks turned to months, life in Pine Ridge returned to normal, mostly. The bank fixed their revolving door, putting in new sensors to prevent anything like that from happening again. The local news moved on to other stories, but sometimes, early in the morning, people would see bears at the edge of town, closer than they had ever come before, just watching. They never caused any trouble, never raided garbage cans or scared anyone. They just watched, as if waiting for something or someone. And sometimes, when Ethan walked with Leo through town, he would catch people looking at them with a mixture of awe and curiosity, as if they were expecting another miracle. Leo grew, as babies do. He learned to walk, to talk, to do all the things normal toddlers do. But Ethan noticed things, the way birds would land near Leo without fear, the way dogs would calm in his presence, even the nervous ones at the vet's office where Ethan's sister worked, the way Leo would sometimes stop and stare at nothing, or what seemed like nothing, and smile as if greeting an old friend. Ethan never asked him about it. Some things he had learned were better left unspoken, allowed to exist in that space between the possible and the impossible. One evening, when Leo was almost 2, Ethan was reading him a bedtime story about a bear. It was just a regular children's book, nothing special, but when he turned to the page with the picture of the bear cub, Leo placed his hand on it and made that sound again, that humming that Ethan hadn't heard in over a year. "Bear friend," Leo said, his first clear 2-word combination. "Bear friend, bye-bye." Ethan's throat tightened. "Yes," he said, "bear friend went bye-bye." Leo nodded, satisfied, and closed his eyes. "Bear friend happy," he murmured as he drifted off to sleep. That night, Ethan dreamed he was in the forest, walking along a path he didn't recognize. Leo was with him, but older, maybe 5 or 6. They came to a clearing where a group of bears was gathered, not threatening, just there, like they were having a meeting. Leo walked forward without fear, and the bears parted to let him through. In the center was the cub from the bank, grown now with cubs of its own. Leo sat down among them, and they all began to hum, that same rhythm from that day at the bank, but fuller now, richer, like a symphony of connection between species. Ethan woke with tears on his face, though he couldn't say why. The dream stayed with him through the following days, coloring everything with a sense of anticipation, like something was coming but he didn't know what. He found himself taking Leo to the park more often, always to that spot where they had seen the bears again. But the tree line remained empty, just trees and shadows and the occasional squirrel. Leo didn't seem disappointed. He would play in the grass, pick dandelions, do normal toddler things. But sometimes Ethan would catch him looking at the forest with that same intense gaze from the day at the bank, as if he was listening to something only he could hear. Spring came early that year, and with it, news that made everyone in Pine Ridge hold their breath. A mother bear with cubs had been spotted near the elementary school. Not threatening, just passing through, but close enough to cancel recess and send parents into a panic. Animal control was called. Plans were made to relocate the bears. But before any of that could happen, something else occurred. Lily Morgan, who taught kindergarten, reported that the bears had simply left on their own, walking calmly back into the forest as if they had just been taking a tour. But she also reported something else, something she only told a few people because she knew how it would sound. She said that just before the bears left, she heard humming coming from her classroom, where the children were supposed to be napping. A rhythmic humming that seemed to come from all of them at once. Ethan heard this story from Lily's husband at the grocery store, and he knew, with a certainty that had nothing to do with logic, that something was changing. Not just in Leo, but in all the children, maybe in the world itself. That night, he sat with Leo on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. "Do you remember the bear?" he asked, not really expecting an answer. Leo was still so young, his vocabulary limited to basic words and phrases, but Leo looked at him with those deep brown eyes and nodded. "Bear friend," he said clearly. "More bear friends coming." Ethan wanted to ask what he meant, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the certainty in Leo's voice, or maybe it was his own growing sense that some doors, once opened, couldn't be closed again. Instead, he just held his son closer and watched the forest edge, where shadows were gathering with the approaching night. Somewhere in those shadows, he was certain, eyes were watching them back. Not with hunger or fear, but with something that might have been recognition, or perhaps hope. The world was changing, had already changed, and his son was somehow at the center of it, a bridge between what was and what might be. The summer passed with an unusual peace settling over Pine Ridge. There were no more bear sightings near town, but hikers reported seeing them in the deep woods, always in groups, always seeming to be heading somewhere with purpose. The local wildlife expert, brought in from the state university, said it was unusual behavior, that bears were typically solitary except for mothers with cubs. But then she added something that made the local news. She said the bears seemed to be gathering in specific locations, almost like they were having meetings. She laughed when she said it, making it clear she was joking, but Ethan could see in her eyes that she wasn't entirely dismissing the possibility. Leo's second birthday approached, and Ethan planned a small party, just family and a few close friends. But the morning of the party, he woke to find Leo standing in his crib, looking out the window with that intense focus that Ethan had come to recognize. "They coming?" Leo said when he saw his father. "Who's coming, buddy?" Ethan asked, though part of him already knew. Leo just smiled and raised his arms to be picked up. As Ethan lifted him, Leo pointed to the window. There, at the edge of their backyard where the grass met the woods, was a line of animals. Not just bears, but deer, rabbits, even a few foxes. They weren't doing anything, just standing there, watching the house. Ethan's first instinct was fear, but Leo was laughing, clapping his hands in delight. "Friends," he said clearly. "Birthday friends." And as Ethan watched, frozen between wonder and worry, each animal dipped its head, almost like a bow, then turned and disappeared back into the forest. The whole thing couldn't have lasted more than 30 seconds, but Ethan knew he would remember it for the rest of his life. When the other parents arrived for the party later, he didn't mention what had happened. How could he? How could he explain that the forest had come to wish his son happy birthday? But throughout the party, he noticed things. The way the other toddlers seemed drawn to Leo, forming a circle around him during a playtime. The way they all went quiet at the same moment, looking toward the forest, then resumed playing as if nothing had happened. The way Jessica Brooks' daughter, who had just started talking, pointed at the trees and said, "Bear," even though there was nothing there, or nothing the adults could see anyway. The parents chatted about normal things, work and weather and the new playground being built downtown, but Ethan could sense an undercurrent of awareness, as if they all knew something was different, but couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge it. That night, after all the guests had gone home and Leo was asleep, Ethan sat on the porch with his laptop, searching for something he couldn't quite name. Stories of children who could communicate with animals, instances of unusual animal behavior, theories about consciousness and connection that mainstream science dismissed, but that might explain what was happening. He found more than he expected. Stories from around the world, throughout history, of children who seemed to bridge the gap between human and animal consciousness. Most were dismissed as folklore or fantasy, but reading them now, Ethan wondered if they were memories of something real, something that occasionally surfaced despite all of humanity's efforts to separate itself from the natural world. He was so absorbed in his reading that he almost missed the sound, that humming coming from Leo's room. Ethan closed the laptop and went to check on his son, expecting to find him having a dream. But Leo was awake, sitting up in his crib, humming that rhythm while looking out the window. And outside, barely visible in the moonlight, something was humming back. Ethan couldn't see what it was, but he could feel it, a presence that was both foreign and familiar. Leo stopped humming and lay back down, already falling asleep. "Good night, friends," he mumbled, and then he was out. Ethan stood there for a long time, watching his son sleep and listening to the night sounds outside. They seemed different now, more purposeful, like a conversation he could almost but not quite understand. He thought about the bear cub in the revolving door, about that moment when Leo had taught it the rhythm of escape. Had that been the beginning of something, or had it simply revealed something that was always there? He didn't have answers, but he was beginning to think the questions themselves might be more important. Fall arrived with a burst of color that seemed especially vivid that year. The maples turned a red so bright it hurt to look at them, and the oaks held on to their gold longer than usual. Leo, now walking confidently and talking in short sentences, spent hours in the backyard, collecting leaves and arranging them in patterns that looked random but felt deliberate. Sometimes Ethan would find him standing perfectly still, a leaf in each hand, humming that rhythm while the wind seemed to dance around him. The neighbors had stopped commenting on it. Everyone in Pine Ridge had developed a kind of protective blindness to the strange things that happened around Leo, as if acknowledging them would break some sort of spell. But the spell, if that's what it was spreading. Haley Dawson's son, who had been diagnosed with autism and rarely spoke, suddenly began humming the same rhythm. Within days, he was not only speaking but seemed to have an uncanny ability to calm aggressive dogs at the animal shelter where his mother volunteered. Connor Adams reported that his daughter had been seen talking to the crows that gathered in their yard, and that they seemed to respond, bringing her shiny objects like gifts. Even the adults were affected. Jacob Bennett mentioned that he'd been having dreams of flying with hawks, dreams so vivid he could feel the wind beneath wings he didn't have. The town council met to discuss what they carefully called recent unusual events, but the meeting dissolved into confusion when they realized they couldn't quite articulate what they were concerned about. Animals being friendly? Children humming? These weren't crimes or problems that required intervention. The mayor, and practical woman named Patricia Wells, finally said what everyone was thinking but no one wanted to voice. Maybe we're not supposed to understand it. Maybe we're just supposed to accept it. The meeting ended with no resolutions, no action items, just a collective agreement to wait and see. Winter came early and hard, with a blizzard that shut down the town for 3 days. On the second night, when the snow was still falling thick and fast, Ethan heard something outside. Not the wind, but movement, deliberate and heavy. He looked out the window and his breath caught. Bears, dozens of them, were moving through the streets. But they weren't foraging or lost. They were checking on houses, looking in windows, almost like they were making sure everyone was okay. At the Henderson house, where old Mr. Henderson lived alone, a bear pushed snow away from his front door with careful paws. At the Murphy place, where a tree had fallen across their driveway, 2 bears worked together to move it. Leo was at the window too, his small hand pressed against the cold glass. "They helping," he said simply. Bears helping people. Ethan wanted to say that bears don't do that what he was seeing was impossible, but the words wouldn't come, because he was seeing it, and so was Leo, and tomorrow the whole town would wake up to find evidence of what the bears had done. Some would explain it away, find rational reasons for the cleared snow and moved trees, but others would know, would add this to the growing list of things that couldn't be explained, but couldn't be denied. The blizzard passed, leaving Pine Ridge buried under 3 feet of snow that sparkled like diamonds in the sudden sunshine. Children poured out of houses to play, and Ethan bundled Leo up to join them. But instead of heading to the park, where the other kids were building snowmen, Leo tugged Ethan toward the forest edge. There, in the pristine snow, were tracks. Bear tracks, deer tracks, fox tracks, all leading to the same spot, a clearing just inside the tree line. Leo walked forward without hesitation, and Ethan followed, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. In the clearing, the snow had been pressed down in a perfect circle, and in the center of that circle was something that made Ethan's knees weak. Patterns in the snow, deliberate and beautiful, that looked almost like writing but not in any language he recognized. Leo walked around the circle, humming his rhythm, and as he did, the patterns seemed to shimmer and shift, becoming almost readable for a moment before returning to their mysterious forms. "Message," Leo said, looking up at his father. "Animals say thank you." Ethan didn't ask how he knew this. He was beyond questioning now, in a space where wonder had replaced doubt. They stayed in the clearing for maybe 10 minutes, Leo playing in the snow while Ethan tried to memorize the patterns, though he knew, even as he did, that memory wouldn't be enough to hold them. When they finally left, Leo turned back and waved, and Ethan could swear he saw shadows moving in the trees, waving back. They walked home in silence, but it was a comfortable silence, full of shared secret and unexplainable joy. That night, Ethan drew what he could remember of the patterns, but they looked like meaningless squiggles on paper, nothing like the living symbols they had been in the snow. Spring came again, and with it, changes that even the most skeptical couldn't ignore. The town's crime rate, never high to begin with, dropped to 0. Not just no violent crimes, but no petty theft, no vandalism, nothing. It was as if the entire town had collectively decided to be better. The animals were part of daily life now. Deer grazed on the elementary school lawn, while children played around them. Bears fished in the river that ran through town, and people picnicked nearby without fear. Birds landed on extended hands, and cats and dogs seemed to understand human speech with uncanny accuracy. Leo, now 3, was at the center of it all, though he seemed unaware of his role. He went to preschool, played with blocks, painted messy pictures, did all the things 3-year-olds do. But he also did other things. He would stop in the middle of play to hum his rhythm, and every child in the room would join him, creating a harmony that made the teachers stop what they were doing and listen. He would walk up to the class hamster's cage and have what appeared to be conversations. complete with pauses for responses only he could hear. Once, when a child fell and skinned her knee, Leo placed his hand on it and hummed, and the crying stopped immediately. The child looking surprised and then delighted. Lily Morgan, who had moved from kindergarten to teaching preschool specifically to work with Leo's class, started keeping a journal of what she observed. Not to publish or share with authorities, but just to document what felt like a pivotal moment in human history. She wrote about the day a hawk flew into the classroom through an open window, perched on Leo's cubby, and stayed for the entire morning, watching the children learn their letters. She wrote about the afternoon when all the children simultaneously stopped playing and walked to the window to watch a funeral procession pass by, humming in perfect harmony a song no one had taught them. She wrote about how the children seemed to know things they shouldn't, like when it would rain or when someone was sad, even if they were smiling. Summer arrived with a heat wave that had everyone seeking shade and water. The town pool was packed, but Leo preferred the river, where the water ran cool and clear. Ethan would take him in the early mornings, before the day got too hot, and they would sit on the bank with their feet in the water, watching the fish swim by. One morning, they arrived to find the bear cub from the bank, now fully grown. Teaching its own cubs to fish, it looked up when it saw them, and Ethan could swear it smiled, if bears could smile. Leo waved, and the bear dipped its head in what had become a familiar greeting. The cubs were clumsy and playful, splashing more than fishing, and Leo laughed at their antics. One of them, braver than the others, waded closer to where Leo sat. Ethan tensed, ready to grab his son and run, but Leo just extended his hand slowly, palm up, the way you would to a shy dog. The cub sniffed his hand, then licked it with a tongue that was surprisingly gentle. Leo giggled, and the cub made a sound that was unmistakably laughter. They played like that for maybe 5 minutes, the cub and the boy, splashing water at each other while both mothers, human and bear, watched with a mixture of worry and wonder. When it was time to go, Leo stood up and did something that took Ethan's breath away. He hugged the cub, a real hug with his small arms wrapped around the bear's furry neck. The cub stood still, then carefully placed one paw on Leo's back in what could only be described as a return hug. They separated. Leo waved goodbye to all the bears, and they walked home. Ethan didn't speak the entire way, couldn't speak past the lump in his throat. His son had just hugged a wild bear cub, and it had hugged him back. And somehow this felt like the most natural thing in the world. That evening, as Ethan tucked Leo into bed, his son looked up at him with those wise brown eyes and said something that would stay with Ethan forever. "Daddy, the animals remember." "Remember what, buddy?" Ethan asked. Leo seemed to think about how to explain something that was clear to him, but might not be to adults. "Before," he finally said. "They remember before when we all talked together. They've been waiting for us to remember too." Then he closed his eyes and fell asleep, leaving Ethan sitting in the dark, wondering if his 3-year-old son had just explained the mystery that had been unfolding since that day at the bank. Ethan went to his computer that night and wrote down everything Leo had said, everything that had happened since the beginning. He didn't know who he was writing for, maybe for Leo when he was older, maybe for himself to make sense of it all, or maybe for some future generation that would need to know that once, in a small town called Pine Ridge, the barrier between human and animal consciousness had become permeable, and a child had shown the way through. He wrote about the bear and the revolving door, about the rhythm that seemed to be a universal language, about the growing awareness that something fundamental was shifting in the relationship between humanity and nature. As he wrote, he heard it again, that humming. But now it wasn't just coming from Leo's room. It was coming from outside, from multiple sources, as if every living thing in Pine Ridge was joining in the rhythm. Ethan walked to the window and looked out at the night. He couldn't see them in the darkness, but he could feel them, all the creatures that had become part of their extended community, and for the first time, he found himself humming along, adding his voice to the chorus. It felt strange at first, but then something shifted, and suddenly he could almost understand it, the message in the rhythm. Not in words, but in feeling, in knowing. It was welcome, it was belonging, it was home. The next morning brought news that would change everything. A video had gone viral, not from Pine Ridge but from a small village in Japan, showing a child, maybe 4 years old, surrounded by monkeys who were clearly protecting him from an aggressive dog. The child was humming, the same rhythm Leo used, and the monkeys were swaying to it. Within hours, similar videos appeared from India, from Brazil, from Norway. Children everywhere were discovering this ability to connect with animals, and the animals were responding. The scientific community was in uproar, theories flying about evolution and consciousness and some kind of global awakening that no one could explain. News crews descended on Pine Ridge, wanting to interview Ethan and Leo to understand how it had started here. But Ethan refused them all. This wasn't something that could be reduced to a news segment or a scientific study. This was something that had to be lived, experienced, felt. The mayor, bless her practical heart, declared a media blackout, saying the town needed to protect its children from becoming specimens or celebrities. The state police, surprisingly, backed her up, setting up roadblocks to keep the curious away. Pine Ridge became an island of calm in a world that was suddenly questioning everything it thought it knew about the relationship between humans and animals. But the children didn't care about the media frenzy or the scientific debates. They just continued being children, playing and learning and growing, but now with an expanded sense of what their playmates could be. The preschool added forest time to their curriculum, where the children would spend an hour each day just sitting in the woods, humming and listening. The local hospital reported that therapy animals were no longer needed. The children themselves had become the healers, visiting patients and bringing a peace that no medicine could provide. Even the nursing home residents seemed affected, with several reporting dreams of flying or running with 4 legs, dreams that left them refreshed rather than confused. Fall came again, Leo's 4th birthday approaching, and Ethan could feel something building, like the whole town was holding its breath for something momentous. Leo had been quieter lately, spending long periods just sitting and humming, his eyes unfocused as if seeing something beyond the physical world. When Ethan asked if he was okay, Leo would just smile and say, "Getting ready." Ready for what? He wouldn't or couldn't say, but Ethan had learned to trust his son's instincts, even when he didn't understand them. The night before Leo's birthday, Ethan woke to find his son's bed empty. Panic shot through him until he heard the humming, coming from outside. He rushed to the window and saw Leo in the backyard, standing in his pajamas and bare feet, surrounded by animals. Not just a few, but hundreds. Bears, deer, foxes, rabbits, even wolves that shouldn't have been anywhere near this part of the country. They formed concentric circles around Leo, all humming in harmony, creating a sound that was both music and language, both ancient and entirely new. Ethan wanted to run outside, to grab his son and bring him to safety, but something held him back. This was important, maybe the most important thing that had ever happened, and he couldn't interfere. He watched as Leo raised his small arms, and the humming grew louder, more complex. The animals began to move, not chaotically but in patterns, like a dance that had been choreographed by nature itself. And then, in a moment that Ethan would struggle to describe for the rest of his life, something shifted. The air itself seemed to shimmer. and for just a second Ethan could understand it all. The message the animals had been trying to convey, the reason for the gathering, the purpose of the children's gift. They were trying to save us, not from some dramatic catastrophe, but from ourselves, from the isolation and disconnection that was slowly killing both humanity and the natural world. The children were the bridge, the translators who could help both sides remember what had been lost. The rhythm wasn't just communication, it was recognition, a remembering of the time before the great forgetting, when all consciousness was recognized as one consciousness expressing itself in myriad forms. Leo and the other children weren't learning something new. They were remembering something ancient, something that had always been there, waiting for the right moment to resurface. The vision, if that's what it was, lasted only a moment, but it changed everything for Ethan. When the animals finally dispersed and Leo came back inside, his feet dirty, but his face glowing with joy, Ethan didn't scold him or ask for explanations. He just wrapped his son in a blanket and held him close, feeling the rhythm of his small heart beating against his chest. "Did you see, Daddy?" Leo asked sleepily. "Did you see the remembering?" Ethan nodded, not trusting his voice. "Good," Leo murmured, already falling asleep. "Now, everybody will remember." The next morning, Leo's 4th birthday. Pine Ridge woke to find the world had changed overnight. Not dramatically, not with fanfare or catastrophe, but subtly, profoundly. People reported dreams of running with wolves, of flying with eagles, of swimming with dolphins. But more than that, they reported understanding, a sudden clarity about their place in the web of life. The businessman who had been planning to develop the woodland into condos withdrew his application. The factory that had been dumping chemicals into the river announced it was switching to clean production methods. Small changes, personal changes, but multiplied across the town, they added up to something revolutionary. The birthday party that afternoon was unlike anything Pine Ridge had ever seen. It wasn't just Leo's friends who came, but the whole town, drawn by something they couldn't quite name. And the animals came too, not as intruders, but as invited guests. Bears sat at the edges of the gathering, birds perched on shoulders, deer grazed nearby. The children moved between human and animal guests without distinction, sharing cake with raccoons and playing tag with fox kits. The adults watched in wonder, some still struggling to accept what they were seeing, others embracing it with tears of joy. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed especially vivid, Leo stood up and walked to the center of the gathering. Without prompting, all the children joined him, forming a circle. They began to hum, that rhythm that had started it all, but now it was fuller, richer, joined by hundreds of young voices. The animals added their own sounds, creating a symphony that was both wild and harmonious. And then, one by one, the adults began to join in. Ethan found himself humming, really humming for the first time, not just mimicking but understanding, feeling the connection that the rhythm represented. The sound grew and spread, moving beyond the party, beyond Pine Ridge. Later, people in neighboring towns would report hearing it, feeling it, being changed by it. Scientists would try to measure it, to understand it, but it would remain beyond their instruments, beyond their theories. Because it wasn't just sound, it was remembering, it was reconnection. It was coming home to something that had always been there, but had been forgotten in the rush to become modern, civilized, separate. As darkness fell and the party wound down, the animals began to leave, but not in the way they had before. Now they moved with purpose, with dignity, with what could only be described as hope. The bear that had been trapped in the revolving door, now fully grown with cubs of its own, stopped in front of Ethan and Leo. It stood on its hind legs, towering over them, and for a moment Ethan felt the old fear. But then the bear did something extraordinary. It placed one massive paw gently on Leo's head, like a blessing, then turned to Ethan and did the same. The weight of it was surprising, but so was the gentleness, the care. Then it dropped to all fours and walked away, its cubs following, disappearing into the darkness that no longer seemed threatening, but full of possibility. That night, as Ethan tucked Leo into bed, his son said something that would become the town's unofficial motto, words that would be painted on the welcome sign and whispered in moments of doubt. "We're not alone, Daddy. We never were. We just forgot how to see." And with that, he closed his eyes and fell asleep, humming softly, while outside the window the night hummed back, a world awakening to its own wholeness, its own interconnected beauty. The weeks that followed Leo's birthday were marked by a series of small miracles that became so common they stopped seeming miraculous. Children throughout Pine Ridge developed their own variations of the gift. Some could calm storms with their humming. Others seemed to know when someone was in trouble, human or animal, and would show up just in time to help. The Madison twins discovered they could help plants grow by singing to them, and soon every garden in town was flourishing beyond anything the climate should have allowed. Even the adults were changing, becoming more intuitive, more connected to the natural rhythms of the world. Ethan returned to work at the architectural firm where he'd been designing standard suburban developments, but now his designs were different. He found himself drawing buildings that worked with nature rather than against it, structures that seemed to grow from the landscape rather than dominate it. His boss initially resisted, but when clients saw the designs, they were enchanted. Soon, Ethan was redesigning the entire downtown area, creating spaces where humans and animals could coexist, where the boundary between civilization and wilderness became blurred and beautiful. The transformation of Pine Ridge didn't go unnoticed by the wider world. Anthropologists came to study what they called a mass consciousness shift. Environmentalists held it up as a model for sustainable living. Religious leaders debated whether this was some kind of spiritual awakening. But the people of Pine Ridge had stopped caring about how others interpreted their experience. They were too busy living it, exploring the new possibilities that opened up when the barriers between species became permeable. Leo started attending a regular preschool, but it was anything but regular anymore. The curriculum had been completely reimagined to include what they called connection time, periods where children would practice their expanding awareness. They learned traditional subjects too, but everything was taught through the lens of interconnection. Math became a study of patterns in nature. Reading included stories told not just in words, but in the languages of wind and water. Science was not about dissecting and categorizing, but about understanding and relating. One day, Lily Morgan asked her class to draw their families. Most children drew typical pictures of parents and siblings, pets and houses. But Leo's drawing was different. He had drawn himself in the center, surrounded by circles that expanded outward. In the first circle were Ethan and his immediate family. In the second were his human friends. But the circles kept going, including the bears, the deer, the birds, the trees, even the rocks and the river. When asked about it, Leo simply said, "This is my family, all of it." The other children looked at his drawing and began adding to their own, expanding their definition of family, until the classroom walls were covered with interconnected circles, a visual representation of the new understanding that was emerging. Winter came again, gentler this time, with soft snows that decorated rather than buried the town. The animals no longer needed to help clear paths. The humans had learned to work with the weather rather than against it. But they still came, the animals drawn by something more than necessity. The town square became a meeting place where species mingled freely. Children built snow sculptures that were part snowman, part snow bear, representing the blurred boundaries that had become normal. Adults sipped hot coffee while chatting with neighbors, both human and otherwise, though the conversations with animals were still mostly one-sided, at least verbally. It was during this peaceful winter that Ethan noticed something new about Leo. His son had started drawing again, but these weren't typical children's drawings. They were patterns, similar to what they had seen in the snow that day in the clearing, but more complex. When asked what they meant, Leo would furrow his brow and say he was trying to remember. Remember what, he couldn't say, but he would spend hours carefully creating these intricate designs, humming while he worked. Other children who saw them would stop and stare, some adding their own marks, as if they too were trying to remember something just out of reach. One evening, Avery Johnson, who had become close friends with Ethan since their children played together, brought over a book she had found in her grandmother's attic. It was old, handwritten in a language neither of them recognized, but the illustrations made them both gasp. They were similar to Leo's drawings, the same kinds of patterns and symbols. Avery's grandmother, when asked, said it had belonged to her great-grandmother, who had been known in their family as someone who could talk to the spirits of the forest. She had been dismissed as eccentric, possibly mentally ill, but now, looking at the book alongside Leo's drawings, they wondered if she had been experiencing something similar to what was happening now. Ethan spent that night comparing the patterns, looking for similarities, trying to decode what felt like an important message. Leo found him in the morning, still at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers. The 4-year-old climbed into his lap, looked at the spread of drawings and symbols, and began to hum. But this was different from his usual rhythm. This was more complex, with rises and falls that seemed to match the curves and angles of the patterns. As he hummed, he traced his finger along the symbols, and suddenly, for just a moment, Ethan could almost read them. Not as words, but as concepts, as feelings, as memories of something ancient and vital. The message, as far as Ethan could understand it, was about cycles, about times when the veil between worlds grew thin and consciousness could flow more freely between forms. These times had come before, recorded in myth and legend, dismissed by modern minds as fantasy. But they were real as what was happening now in Pine Ridge. The children were not the first to bridge the gap. They were simply the latest in a long line of bridges, appearing when the world needed them most, when the separation had become too painful, too destructive to continue. Spring arrived with an explosion of life that surpassed even Pine Ridge's new normal. Flowers bloomed in impossible abundance. Birds filled the air with songs that seemed to carry meaning beyond melody, and the river ran clearer than anyone could remember. It was as if nature itself was celebrating, welcoming humanity back into the fold. The town council, which had initially struggled with how to handle the changes, now embraced them fully. They passed ordinances that recognized the rights of all inhabitants, human and non-human alike. They designated large areas as shared spaces where the usual rules of human dominance didn't apply. It was in one of these shared spaces that the next phase of the transformation began. Leo and a group of children were playing when they encountered a deer that had been injured, its leg caught in some old fencing that should have been removed years ago. The children gathered around it, not with the panic that might have been expected, but with calm purpose. They began to hum, all of them together, creating a harmony that made the air itself seem to vibrate. Leo placed his hands on the deer's injured leg, and the other children followed suit, creating a circle of small hands on brown fur. What happened next would have been called a miracle if it hadn't become almost commonplace. The wound began to close, the torn flesh knitting together under their touch. But more than that, the old fence wire that had caused the injury began to rust and crumble, as if time itself was accelerating around it. Within minutes, the deer was standing, whole and healthy, nuzzling the children in gratitude before bounding away. The children acted as if nothing extraordinary had happened, returning to their play, but the adults who had witnessed it stood in stunned silence. Michael Hayes, ever the practical hardware store owner, was the first to speak. "They're healing more than just animals," he said slowly. "They're healing the damage we've done. All of it." And he was right. Over the following weeks, reports came in from all over town. The old quarry that had been an eyesore for decades was slowly filling with clear water, becoming a haven for wildlife. The contaminated soil near the old gas station was somehow clean again, supporting wildflowers that shouldn't have been able to grow there. Even the air seemed cleaner, fresher, as if the very atmosphere was being renewed. But with these gifts came responsibility, and the children seemed to understand this instinctively. They didn't use their abilities frivolously or for personal gain. They helped when help was needed, healed when healing was required, but otherwise they remained normal children, playing and laughing and occasionally throwing tantrums over toys or snacks. It was this normalcy that perhaps made the extraordinary acceptable, that allowed the adults to integrate the miraculous into daily life without losing their minds to wonder or fear. One afternoon, Ethan received a call from his sister in Seattle. She was crying, barely coherent, saying something about her daughter, Ethan's niece, being in the hospital with something the doctors couldn't diagnose. Without hesitation, Ethan packed up the car and headed west with Leo, driving through the night while his son slept peacefully in the back seat. They arrived at the hospital to find 6-year-old Emma, pale and unresponsive, machines beeping around her while doctors spoke in hushed, worried tones. Leo walked into the room and straight to his cousin's bed, climbing up despite the protests of nurses. He placed his small hand on Emma's forehead and began to hum, that same rhythm that had started everything. At first, nothing happened. Then Emma's eyelids fluttered. Her breathing, which had been shallow and labored, deepened. Color returned to her cheeks. And then, miraculously, she opened her eyes and smiled. "I heard you calling," she said to Leo. "From really far away, I heard you calling me back." The doctors ran tests, scanned machines, consulted specialists, but they could find no explanation for the sudden recovery. Emma was simply well, completely and inexplicably well. But something else had happened during that healing. Emma had changed, gained the same ability that Leo and the Pine Ridge children had. On the drive back home, with Emma and her mother following in their own car, Ethan watched in the rearview mirror as birds began following them, flying in formation above their little convoy. By the time they reached Pine Ridge, it was clear that the gift was spreading, not randomly but purposefully, as if the children were a network, connected across distances, able to share their abilities with those who needed them. The scientific community was in chaos. Everything they thought they knew about consciousness, about the separation between species, about the nature of reality itself, was being challenged by a group of children who couldn't even tie their own shoes properly. Some scientists embraced the mystery, coming to Pine Ridge to observe and learn with open minds. Others rejected it entirely, claiming mass hysteria or elaborate hoax. But the evidence was mounting, not just from Pine Ridge but from around the world, of children discovering they could communicate with animals, heal with touch, and sense the interconnectedness of all life. Religious leaders were equally divided. Some saw it as a sign of divine intervention, a return to Eden where lion and lamb could lie down together. Others worried it was something else, something that challenged the established order of creation. But the children themselves showed no interest in these debates. They were too busy living the reality of connection, of being part of something larger than any single religion or philosophy could contain. As summer approached, Pine Ridge prepared for what they were calling the gathering. No one had officially organized it, but somehow everyone knew it was coming. The children had been humming more frequently, and the animals had been arriving in greater numbers, not just the local wildlife, but creatures that had traveled from far away. Wolves from Canada, panthers from Florida, even a few exotic birds that must have escaped from zoos or private collections. They all came to Pine Ridge, drawn by something that transcended instinct. The night of the summer solstice, the longest day of the year, the gathering began. The entire town converged on the large meadow at the edge of the forest. No one had sent invitations, but everyone came, from the youngest baby to the oldest resident. The animals were already there, arranged in that same pattern of concentric circles that Leo had drawn months ago. In the center was a clear space, waiting. Leo walked forward, along with the other children who had the gift. They formed their own circle in that central space and began to hum. But this time, it wasn't just the children. One by one, the adults began to join in, finding they could produce the rhythm even without fully understanding it. The animals added their voices, each species contributing its own note to create a harmony that was both complex and simple, both foreign and familiar. As the sun set, painting the sky in impossible colors, something shifted. The boundaries between individuals began to blur, not physically, but in awareness. For a moment, everyone present could feel what others were feeling, see through other eyes, experience consciousness from multiple perspectives simultaneously. The fear of the rabbit, the strength of the bear, the freedom of the hawk, the curiosity of the child, all of it was present, all of it was real, all of it was one. In that moment of unity, a message came through, not in words, but in direct knowing. This was not an ending, but a beginning. The children were the first wave of a transformation that would take generations to complete. Humanity was being invited back into the community of life, not as masters, but as participants, not as separate, but as integrated. The choice was being offered. Continue on the path of separation and face the consequences, or remember the connection and thrive. The vision lasted only moments in clock time, but it felt like hours, like years, like a lifetime of understanding compressed into a single, shared experience. When it ended, when individuals became individuals again, there were tears on many faces, human and animal alike. Something fundamental had shifted. The world looked the same, but everyone knew it would never be the same again. In the days that followed the gathering, Pine Ridge became a place of pilgrimage. People came from around the world, drawn by stories that seemed too fantastic to be true. Some came seeking healing, others seeking understanding, still others simply seeking hope in a world that often seemed hopeless. Not everyone could perceive what was happening. The gift seemed to require a certain openness, a willingness to let go of rigid beliefs about what was possible. But for those who could open themselves to it, Pine Ridge offered a glimpse of a different way of being. Leo, now 5, started kindergarten in the fall. His teacher, Mrs. Patricia Chen, had moved to Pine Ridge specifically to work with these extraordinary children. She had been a neuroscientist before, studying consciousness and cognition, but the events in Pine Ridge had made her realize that everything she thought she knew was just the beginning. She structured her classroom around exploration and connection rather than rote learning, encouraging the children to teach each other and learn from the world around them. One day, She asked the class to explain what they experienced when they connected with animals. Most of the children struggled to put it into words, but Leo offered an analogy that Patricia would never forget. "It's like when you're listening to music," he said, "and suddenly you're not just hearing it, you're inside it, you are it. The bird isn't different from me, we're both notes in the same song." The other children nodded, understanding immediately what might take adults years of meditation to grasp. As autumn painted the leaves in brilliant colors once again, Ethan reflected on how much had changed in just a few years. His son had gone from a baby to a young boy who carried within him a gift that might help heal the ancient wound between humanity and nature. Pine Ridge had transformed from an ordinary small town to a beacon of hope for a different future. And he himself had changed, from a skeptical adult to someone who could sometimes, in quiet moments, feel the rhythm that connected all things. But perhaps the most remarkable change was how ordinary it had all become. Children talking to animals was no longer a miracle, but a daily occurrence. Bears walking through town was no longer frightening, but neighborly. The impossible had become possible, and then, through repetition and acceptance, had become normal. This, Ethan realized, was how real change happened. Not through dramatic revolution, but through the quiet accumulation of small shifts in perception. One evening, as the first snow of winter began to fall, Leo came to Ethan with a serious expression on his young face. "Daddy," he said, "the animals want to show us something important." Ethan didn't question it anymore, just bundled them both up and followed Leo out into the snowy night. They walked to the clearing where they had first seen the patterns in the snow years ago. And there they found not just animals but other families from Pine Ridge, all drawn by the same call. In the center of the clearing, the snow was falling differently, swirling in patterns that seemed deliberate, purposeful. As they watched, the patterns began to form images, like a movie made of snowflakes. They saw the earth from above, saw the forests shrinking, the oceans warming, the connections between all life fraying. But then the images shifted, showed children around the world discovering their gifts, showed adults remembering their connection to nature, showed a future where humans and animals work together to heal what had been broken. "This is why," Leo said softly, his breath making small clouds in the cold air. "This is why we can talk to them now, because we need each other. We need to remember that we're all part of the same family, or the family will die." The 5-year-old's words carried a weight that made all the adults present shiver with more than cold. This wasn't just a gift, it was a responsibility, a call to action that went beyond Pine Ridge, beyond any single community. As the snow vision faded and the families walked home through the quiet streets, each person carried with them a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. The children had shown them the way, but it would take everyone, human and animal alike, to walk the path. The revolution that had started with a bear cub and a revolving door had become something much larger, much more important than anyone could have imagined. Winter deepened, bringing with it a peace that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. The children continued to develop their abilities, but now, with a focus that suggested they understood their role in something larger. They organized themselves without adult intervention, creating councils where they would sit in circles and hum together, sharing information in ways that didn't require words. Sometimes adults would find them like this. A dozen children sitting silently in someone's living room or backyard, eyes closed, humming in harmony, and the adults would know that something important was happening even if they couldn't fully understand what. One particularly cold morning, Ethan woke to find Leo's bed empty again, but this time he wasn't worried. He found his son in the backyard, sitting in the snow in his pajamas, surrounded by a circle of warmth that kept the snow melted in a perfect ring around him. Animals sat just outside the circle, all facing inward, all perfectly still. Leo's eyes were closed, but tears were streaming down his face. When Ethan approached, Leo opened his eyes and looked at his father with an expression too old for his years. "They're saying goodbye," Leo whispered. "Not forever, but for now. They say we've remembered enough. Now we have to practice. We have to show others." And as Ethan watched, the animals began to leave, not all at once, but gradually, returning to their wild lives. But the connection remained. Ethan could feel it, like an invisible thread linking all life. A thread that had always been there but was now visible, tangible, undeniable. The departure of the animals might have felt like an ending, but it was really a graduation. The children of Pine Ridge had learned what they needed to learn, and now it was time to teach. Families began moving to Pine Ridge not to witness miracles, but to learn how to create them in their own communities. The children, with the innocent wisdom that only they possessed, became teachers to adults who had forgotten how to see the world through eyes of wonder. Spring came early that year, and with it, a surprise that delighted everyone. The animals hadn't really gone. They had simply returned to their normal patterns, but with a difference. They no longer needed to be constantly present because the connection had been established. A bear might walk through town once a week, checking in like an old friend. Birds would deliver messages, landing on windowsills and singing specific songs that the children could interpret. The deer would gather at the edge of town each evening, not approaching but simply being present, maintaining the bond. Leo started first grade, and with it came new challenges. How do you teach a child to read and write when he can already read the language of the wind? How do you explain arithmetic to someone who understands the mathematical patterns in spider webs and snowflakes? The education system in Pine Ridge had to evolve, and quickly. Traditional subjects were still taught, but they were integrated with what the children called the real learning, understanding the interconnectedness of all things, developing empathy that crossed species boundaries, and taking responsibility for the world they were inheriting. One day, a delegation from the United Nations arrived in Pine Ridge. They had been sent to investigate what some were calling the most significant evolutionary leap in human history. They came with scientists, philosophers, reporters, all wanting to understand what was happening. The mayor, still practical Patricia Wells, met them at the town hall with a simple message. You can observe, you can learn, but you cannot dissect or exploit. What's happening here is not a phenomenon to be studied, but a gift to be received. The delegation was skeptical at first, but after a week in Pine Ridge, watching children heal injured birds with their touch, seeing adults learning to hear the messages in birdsong, witnessing the casual interaction between humans and wildlife, even the most hardened skeptics began to soften. One scientist, Dr. James Crawford, who had come to debunk what he assumed was mass delusion, ended up staying for 3 months. On his last day, he was seen humming the rhythm while a squirrel ate from his hand, tears streaming down his face. The story of Pine Ridge spread, not through media coverage, which had been limited by the town's protective policies, but through personal testimonies, through videos that couldn't be explained away, through the gradual realization that something fundamental was shifting in the relationship between humanity and the rest of the living world. Other communities began reporting similar occurrences. Children in urban areas were befriending pigeons and rats, finding beauty and intelligence where before there had been only pests. Rural communities were discovering that cooperation with wildlife led to better harvests and healthier ecosystems. But it wasn't without challenges. There were those who saw the changes as a threat to human dominance, who believed that the separation between human and animal was divinely ordained or scientifically necessary. There were industries that stood to lose profits if humans no longer saw nature as a resource to be exploited. There were fears, some reasonable and some not, about what would happen if the boundaries dissolved completely. Would humans lose their humanity? Would civilization collapse? Would we become animals ourselves? Leo, now 6 and remarkably articulate for his age, addressed these fears at a town meeting that had been called to discuss the future of Pine Ridge. Standing on a box so he could reach the microphone, he spoke with the clarity that had become characteristic of the gifted children. "We're not becoming less human," he said, his young voice carrying through the packed auditorium. "We're becoming more human. Humans were always supposed to be the ones who could talk to everyone, who could help everyone understand each other. We just forgot for a while, but forgetting doesn't change what's true." His words were simple, but they resonated. The fear began to dissipate, replaced by curiosity and, in many cases, hope. If children could learn this, could adults? The answer came gradually, as more and more adults in Pine Ridge began to develop their own versions of the gift. It was usually subtler than what the children experienced, more like enhanced intuition than direct communication, but it was real. Ethan found he could sense the health of trees by touching their bark. Jessica Brooks discovered she could calm aggressive dogs with her presence alone. Even skeptical Michael Hayes admitted that he now knew when storms were coming because the birds told him. Summer arrived with a sense of anticipation. It had been 3 years since the bear cub in the revolving door. 3 years since Leo had first hummed the rhythm that changed everything. The town decided to commemorate the anniversary, not with a formal ceremony but with a celebration of connection. They called it the Festival of Remembering, and it drew people from around the world. But it wasn't a spectacle or a performance. It was simply a gathering of those who had remembered or were trying to remember their place in the family of life. The festival lasted 3 days, filled with music that incorporated the rhythm, with art that depicted the patterns the children had been drawing, with stories shared around fires about moments of connection across species boundaries. Children taught adults how to listen with more than their ears, how to see with more than their eyes. Animals came and went freely, no longer remarkable but simply part of the community. And on the final night something magical happened. As the sun set on the 3rd day, everyone gathered in the meadow where the gathering had taken place the year before. Without any signal, without any leader, everyone began to hum together. Not just the people, but the animals too, each adding their voice to create a symphony of connection. The sound rose and spread, carried on the wind beyond Pine Ridge, beyond the state, perhaps beyond what anyone could measure. And in that moment, everyone present knew that this was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a new chapter in the long history of life on Earth. The impact of that festival rippled outward in ways no one could have predicted. Videos of the mass humming went viral, but more importantly, people who watched them reported feeling something shift inside themselves. Children in cities around the world began humming the rhythm spontaneously. Adults found themselves paying attention to birds and insects in ways they never had before. Animal shelters reported a surge in adoptions, but also a change in the animals themselves, as if they knew something had shifted and they could trust again. Scientists struggled to explain what was happening. Some proposed theories about morphic resonance or quantum entanglement. Others suggested it was purely psychological, a mass awakening to something that had always been possible but suppressed by cultural conditioning. Still, others threw up their hands and admitted that science might not have the tools to understand this phenomenon, that perhaps it required a different kind of knowing altogether. But while the experts debated, the transformation continued, child by child, family by family, community by community. Leo, now approaching his 7th birthday, had become something of a reluctant ambassador for the gifted children. He didn't seek attention, but when important visitors came to Pine Ridge, they inevitably wanted to meet the boy who had started it all. He would sit with them, patient and polite, answering their questions as best he could. But he always emphasized that he hadn't started anything. He had simply been the first to remember what was always there. Every child can do this, he would say. Every person can do this. You just have to listen with your whole self, not just your ears. One visitor, a prominent tech billionaire who had come to Pine Ridge to see if the phenomenon could be replicated through technology, left with a completely different understanding. After spending a day with Leo and the other children, after experiencing the humming and feeling the connection himself, he liquidated most of his assets and devoted his resources to creating sanctuaries where children and animals could interact freely, where the gift could flourish without interference. Technology was supposed to connect us, he said in his final public interview, but it separated us from what really matters. These children are showing us the original network, the one that doesn't require satellites or servers, just open hearts and willing minds. As autumn approached once again, Ethan found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. His son was no longer the baby who had first hummed to a trapped bear cub. He was a young boy who carried wisdom beyond his years, who could speak to creatures of all kinds, who was helping to bridge a gap that humans had created and maintained for centuries. But he was also still a child who loved bedtime stories and chocolate chip cookies, who sometimes had tantrums and always needed hugs. This balance, Ethan realized, was perhaps the most important lesson. The gift didn't make the children less human. It made them more fully themselves. The transformation of Pine Ridge was nearly complete, but it was a transformation that respected what had come before, while embracing what was emerging. The town still had its main street with shops and restaurants. People still went to work and school, still celebrated holidays and birthdays. But now, these human activities were woven into a larger tapestry that included all life. The barber shop had a family of birds nesting in its sign, and no one suggested removing them. The library had a fox that regularly slept on its front steps, and people would carefully step around it. The elementary school had incorporated forest days into its curriculum, where classes were held entirely outdoors, with wildlife as both observers and participants. One crisp October morning, Leo came to Ethan with news that would mark the next phase of their journey. "Dad," he said, his brown eyes serious, "I've been having dreams. Not regular dreams, but the kind where the animals are teaching me something. They're showing me other places, other children who are ready to remember but don't know how. They want me to help." Ethan's first instinct was to protect, to keep his son safe in Pine Ridge where the gift was understood and celebrated. But he looked at Leo's determined face and knew that this gift came with responsibility, that hiding it away would be a betrayal of everything they had learned. So they began to plan. Not a grand tour or a publicity campaign, but a quiet journey to communities where children were showing signs of the gift but didn't have the support structure Pine Ridge had developed. They would go as teachers, as helpers, as bridges between what was and what could be. Lily Morgan would come with them, bringing her experience as an educator. A few of the older gifted children would join them, creating a small team of ambassadors for the remembering. The night before they were to leave on their first trip, to a small reservation in South Dakota where children had been reported talking to buffalo, the whole town gathered to see them off. It wasn't a sad farewell, but a celebration of purpose. The children who were staying formed a circle around those who were leaving. humming the rhythm that had become Pine Ridge's heartbeat. The animals came too, emerging from forest and field to add their voices to the farewell. And in that moment, Ethan understood that Pine Ridge had never been the destination. It had been the starting point. As they drove away the next morning, Leo looked back at the town that had nurtured his gift and smiled. "We'll be back," he said, with the confidence of someone who had learned to trust the connections that bind all life. "But first, we have to help others remember. That's what the animals want. That's what the earth needs." And as they headed toward the horizon, a red-tailed hawk appeared, flying alongside their car for miles, a guardian and guide for the journey ahead. The reservation they arrived at was different from Pine Ridge in every way, except the one that mattered. Here, too, children were discovering they could communicate with animals, specifically with the buffalo that had been reintroduced to the land. But unlike Pine Ridge, where the community had embraced the change, here there was fear and confusion. Some saw it as a return of ancient ways, a blessing from the ancestors. Others worried it was something dangerous, unpredictable, that it would bring unwanted attention to a community that had already suffered too much. Leo and the other Pine Ridge children didn't come as experts or saviors. They came as friends, as fellow travelers on a strange and wonderful journey. They played with the local children, shared their experiences, showed them the patterns and taught them the rhythm. But more importantly, they listened. They learned that here, the gift manifested differently, that the buffalo communication came through dreams and visions rather than direct humming. They discovered that each place, each community had its own variation of the remembering, shaped by its history, its land, its particular relationship with the natural world. An elder of the tribe, a woman named Mary Crowfeather, took Leo aside one evening and told him something that would stay with him forever. "Your gift is not new," she said, her weathered face kind but serious. "My grandmother's grandmother knew this language. All peoples once knew it. But we were made to forget, told it was savage, primitive, wrong. Now the children are remembering what was stolen from us. But be careful, young bridge builder. There are those who will want to steal it again, to use it for power or profit. Keep it pure, keep it free." They stayed on the reservation for 2 weeks, and by the time they left, the fear had largely transformed into wonder. The children were teaching the adults, just as it happened in Pine Ridge. The buffalo, which had been seen as symbols but kept at a distance, were now recognized as relatives, as teachers, as part of the community. And most remarkably, some of the elders were remembering stories their grandparents had told, stories that had been dismissed as myth but were now recognized as instruction manuals for a way of being that was both ancient and urgently needed. The journey continued. They visited a fishing village in Alaska where children were learning to hear the songs of whales. They went to a suburb of Detroit where kids were befriending the coyotes that had moved into abandoned lots. They traveled to a farm in Iowa where children were discovering they could help crops grow by singing to them. Each place brought new variations of the gift, new challenges, new victories, and always the same pattern emerged, children leading the way, adults gradually following. Animals responding with joy and relief that the long silence was ending. But it wasn't always easy or welcomed. In one town in Texas, they were met with hostility from religious leaders who saw the gift as satanic, who believed that humans talking to animals was a sign of the end times. They had to leave quickly, but not before a few children had secretly learned the rhythm, carrying it forward despite the opposition. In a wealthy suburb of New York, parents wanted to monetize their children's abilities, to turn them into performers or therapeutic tools for profit. Leo and his team had to carefully explain that the gift didn't work that way, that it withered when used for selfish purposes, that it only flourished in an atmosphere of genuine connection and care. Through it all, Leo grew from a gifted child into something more. A young teacher who understood not just how to communicate across species, but how to help others find their own path to connection. He developed a sensitivity to the unique needs of each community, knowing instinctively when to push forward and when to step back. Ethan watched his son with a mixture of pride and awe, recognizing that Leo had become something he could never have imagined when he first held him as a baby, a bridge between worlds, a translator of the ancient language that connected all life. After 6 months of traveling, they returned to Pine Ridge for a rest and to share what they had learned. The town welcomed them back with joy, eager to hear about the spreading remembering. But they also brought back more than stories. They brought new techniques, new understandings, new ways of deepening the connection. The children of Pine Ridge incorporated these learnings into their own practice, and the gift evolved, became richer, more nuanced. One evening, as Ethan tucked Leo into his own bed for the first time in months, his son said something that revealed how much he had grown. "Dad, I used to think we were special, that Pine Ridge was chosen somehow. But now, I know that's not true. Every place is special. Every child has the gift. We were just the first to remember in this time, but we won't be the last. And someday it won't be special at all. It will just be normal, the way things are supposed to be." That night, Ethan stood at his window looking out at the familiar streets of Pine Ridge, but seeing them differently. The town had become a beacon, but it was no longer alone. Lights were appearing all over the world, communities where the remembering was taking hold. The network of connection that the children had revealed was spreading, strengthening, becoming impossible to ignore or deny. The world was changing, not through force or revolution, but through the simple act of remembering what had always been true, that all life was connected, that communication across species was not only possible but necessary, that the children were showing the way back to a wholeness that had been fractured but never truly broken. As he watched, a familiar form appeared at the edge of the yard. The bear from the revolving door, now full-grown and majestic, stood at the tree line. It looked up at Ethan's window, and in its eyes Ethan saw recognition, gratitude, and something that looked like hope. He raised his hand in greeting, and the bear dipped its head in response before melting back into the forest. The connection held, across years and species and all the barriers humans had built. And in that moment, Ethan knew that Leo was right. This was not the end of something, but the beginning of a return to what should have always been.